great to have you back as we're continuing our studies of the book of Revelation. As you know, I'd hoped we'd be back in the gymnasium by this time, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen for a little while. So welcome to my in-home family room classroom. It's nice to have you there, or at least imagine that you're out there, and I hope all is going well with you. And we'll look forward, hopefully sometime in the near future, to be back together in our normal venue. As you know, we're working our way through the book of Revelation. We've made it just halfway. Our last year together, we brought it right through to the end of chapter 11. And so today we're going to be launching our studies of the last half of Revelation, which begin in chapter 12, verse 1. So that's where we're going to be picking up in just a moment. I think I've mentioned to you before that in many ways Revelation tells the same story twice. And so in some ways what we're going to see in the last half of Revelation is a repetition of what we saw in the first half, but from a different perspective, adding some new detail. There was a great culmination, you recall, in the first half. We reached the end of chapter 11 in this wonderful triumphant declaration, loud voices in heaven that said, the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. That's really the point. That's where Revelation has been heading. That's the train pulling into the station. Christ established his kingdom. He's going to reign forever and ever. That really is the point of the book. But now we need to hear it again. But we need to hear it from a slightly different perspective. So as we start chapter 12, we're going to be introduced to a perspective that incorporates, in a very significant way, the people of God. So the first half of Revelation was really a focus on Christ, his victory, and now we're going to see his victory for sure, but we're going to see it especially as it is carried out on behalf of and for the benefit of his people. So the church really is at the heart of the discussion that we pick up this morning. And in some ways, we're going to see that right away. Chapter 12, verse 1, introduces us to this image of a woman who's about to give birth. I think you know that throughout the scriptures, the woman is often pictured as the one who is the bride or the wife of her covenant husband. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is the covenant husband of his people Israel. Oftentimes they weren't very faithful to that covenant, as you're well aware, and would sometimes get very harsh rebukes, being regarded as a harlot or a wayward woman. I mean, you are familiar with that from discussions in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have the same idea, however. The woman image, the bride of Christ, is really one of the most important ways in which the church is described. So as we are introduced now in chapter 12 to a woman, we need to immediately recognize that she stands in some great sense for the people of God throughout history, but especially the people of God in anticipation of the events that are being described here in Revelation. So we're going to cover the first 6 verses of Revelation, chapter 12. Not too much to cover, but we'll do a little bit of background as well and kind of get ourselves reoriented as we get started. So this is it, Revelation chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. This is the Word of God. A great and marvelous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled to a place prepared for her in the desert, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So there's our text. Let's ask God's blessing on our consideration of it. Our Father, we're so grateful for this opportunity to once again gather together in this way and to continue our studies of this remarkable book of Revelation. We pray that the same Spirit that guided the pen of the apostle who originally wrote these words would be present with us as we seek to understand them. And for all of that, we give you thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. So, we're introduced to a woman, a great sign appearing in heaven. As I mentioned to you a moment ago, the first half of Revelation really emphasizes Christ and his victory, but now we have the church incorporated into the discussion. So in some ways the same story is told, but in this case told, as it were, with a special emphasis on the way in which the people of God are protected and cared for in the great drama that's being described for us. One of the most significant and insightful commentators on the book of Revelation from another generation, Dr. Milton Terry, described the two sides of Revelation in the following words. He said, quote, "Part first has revealed the Lamb of God under various symbols, glorious in power, opening the book of divine mysteries," that scroll that we saw back in chapter 6, "avenging the martyred saints, exhibiting fearful judgments destined to come upon the enemies of God. Everything is viewed as from the throne of the King of Heaven." That great image of the throne room, chapters 4 and 5. "He sends forth his armies and destroys the defiant murderers of his prophets and burns up their city." So those are familiar themes. We've looked at all of those in some detail, of course, in our prior conversation. But now Terry continues to give a summary of what happens in the last half of this book. He says, part second reveals the church in conflict with infernal and worldly principalities and powers, surviving all persecution, triumphing by the word of her testimony, and after Babylon the harlot falls and passes from view, appearing as the wife of the Lamb, the tabernacle of God with men, glorious in her beauty and imperishable as the throne of God. So this is really going to be the theme that will occupy our thoughts, and we'll return to it repeatedly as we proceed through this latter half of Revelation. You may recall that when we were looking at the first half, we saw various themes and images that came to light, and we're not surprised to see that many of those same themes and images and symbols are going to become evident in the second half as well. There is a little bit of repetition here, you see, and so it'll help us as we triangulate the meaning of some of these signs and symbols that come to our attention. In chapter 9, we ran into a character, the angel of the abyss. Well, we run into this character again, of course, in the latter half. In chapter 20, we're going to run into this. This really is this satanic character that we run into right here in chapter 12 of Revelation. In chapter 7, we encountered the 144,000, highlighting those Jewish Christian people in Jerusalem who escaped the judgments that befell that city. We find them again in chapter 14, the same 144,000. The 7 trumpets that we run into in chapters 8 and 9 give us various descriptions of judgments that were poured out against Jerusalem. Well, virtually point for point, in a kind of paralleled discussion, we find those same judgments in the form of the 7 vials that are brought to our attention in chapter 16. You remember in chapter 11, we hear of one that John calls the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. The 2 witnesses, of course, being described there. Well, that great city is once again introduced to us later in Revelation, the great city, who is now going to be called the harlot city, is now going to be called the great Babylon, and of course is to be identified with Jerusalem. There can only be one, the great city, you know, and it's the same city throughout the entire book. You recall in chapter 11 also, John was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told to go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshipers there. The word for temple, you may recall, is the word naos. The word naos doesn't refer to the entire external structure of the temple, but to that holy of holies, that most holy place, a cubical room right in the middle of the temple, and that's where, figuratively speaking, all the true worshipers of God are. They are there. But now in the latter part of Revelation, that little cubicle room is greatly expanded, 12,000 stadia, thousands of miles, because it now incorporates all the people of God. It's still the Holy of Holies. It's still that inner sanctum, but now it has become, in the great expansive language that comes to us later, the New Jerusalem. It has become also called the bride of the Lamb, beautifully dressed, beautifully adorned for her husband. It is this woman that we're speaking of in the emblems and symbols that we find throughout Revelation. Well, I was saying to you in prior conversations that I like to think of Revelation, and many have seen it this way, as a kind of worship drama in 2 acts. And so Act 1, the first half, is made up of 3 scenes. The first scene, you may recall, was the throne room. John is taken into that place. And then the second scene are the 7 seals on a scroll that are being broken. Well, the scroll, of course, stands for the inauguration of the New Covenant era. But it cannot get started without upheaval. There's birth pangs to the launching of the covenant era, you see. And so the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, all of those symbols and images are designed to talk about the kind of tumultuous upheaval that will be associated with it. The third scene was the 7 trumpets, detailing the judgments that would befall the city of Jerusalem. And so all of that, of course, is given to us, culminating then with the final trumpet, which is the declaration, as we said before, that the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. Well, the second half of Revelation is also an act, Act 2, if you will, in 3 scenes. The first scene I'm calling the redemption of God's people. It introduces this woman, and we're going to see the drama connected with her as we go along. The second scene, the vindication of God's people. This is the 7 vials that are poured out on the city, paralleling the 7 trumpets that we saw earlier. The third scene, the elevation of God's people. This magnificent image of a great city coming down from heaven. This great cubicle structure, you see, really the representation of the Holy of Holies. But now we are the temple of God. We are the population, the living stones, as we read elsewhere in the New Testament, that constitutes this wonderful picture of the people of God, the church, styled for us there as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Well, right now we're at Scene 1, Act 2, and this I'm calling the redemption of God's people. It has 7 little subparts to it. What are these? The first one, the woman and the dragon. That's what we're looking at this time together. We just reviewed that text 1 through 6. Later on in chapter 12, we'll look at this next time we're together, the dragon is ejected. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon fought back. He was not strong enough. He was kicked out of heaven, you see. That's the language that we find there. Who is this character, this dragon? Well, the text itself explicitly identifies this one as the devil and Satan. In the New Testament, we think of Satan as a proper name. In the Old Testament, it's never used as a proper name. It always comes in the form ha, Satan. The definite article ha there, the, we would say, and Satan, Satan, is a title. It's an office. It's a function, you might say. It only becomes a personal name in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, this character is what we would call a prosecutor. We see hints of this in various places in the Old Testament. Maybe the most dramatic example is the early chapters of the book of Job. You recall this strange setting in which we hear that the sons of God are gathered together in the presence of God, and it's kind of a divine council situation. It's really a courtroom picture. And then one called Ha-Satan, the prosecutor, appears. And he lodges charges, brings an indictment against one of God's own, Job, you see, who's going to become the target of a special prosecutorial effort. And this is really the idea. That's the role that the prosecutor uses against God's people in the Old Testament. But you see, here's the point. With the work of Christ, with his atoning sacrifice, with his victory over Satan and over death and over sin, the prosecutor got disbarred. He got kicked out. He doesn't have a role to play anymore. He got kicked out of heaven. He lost his status. Well, he wasn't very happy about that, as you can imagine. And so we hear, as the story unfolds, that he launches a war against the woman. Those women, that woman is the people of God who then escape, you see, to a place of protection. We'll look at that in the latter part of Revelation chapter 12. Then he summons two minions to work with him and on his behalf. A beast from the sea, a beast from the land, corrupt politics married to corrupt religion. And they launch a campaign empire-wide against God's people here and there, wherever they can be found. Really, Revelation was written to warn people about this great assault that would be brought to bear against them. But we also learn in chapter 14 that the Lamb is safe and secure with his people on Mount Zion, and that they are singing a song of praise to him. He summons three angels to give the final announcement of the harvest of the earth. And in the latter part of chapter 14, we hear of a harvest of those people who are the possession of God, who belong to him, who are gathered together into the great fellowship of the church. We also hear of a harvest, which is the grapes of wrath, you see, in which these are harvested, they're thrown into the winepress of God's wrath, trampled there, blood flows out of the press. It's graphic, really ghastly imagery, but it is once again standing for the great judgments and the redemption that are going to take place. So that's the section of Revelation that we are presently concerned with. And as I say, we're right now at the very beginning of it. And so what do we have? We have John saying there is a great sign, the Greek word semeion. We talked about this word early in our studies of Revelation, I hope you remember that, in which we said signs, of course, by their nature, point to a reality greater than themselves. And Revelation is a book of signs. It's a book in which various images and symbols are pointing to things other than and greater than the sign itself. So here we have a sign, and the sign is a woman. The word semeion is actually used precisely 7 times in the last half of the book of Revelation. 3 of those times it is referencing a heavenly sign. This is the first of them, the woman. The dragon that we see in verse 3 is the second heavenly sign. Of course, he's not going to stay in heaven very long. He's about to get booted, you know, but right at the moment, in terms of the imagery, he's there. The third heavenly sign begins chapter 15 and is 7 angels with the 7 last plagues. So 3 of these are heavenly signs. They are realities. 4, however, are earthly signs. So 3 for heaven, 4 for earth. And in each case, the word semeion, when used in connection with earthly signs, is a lying, deceitful sign. In chapter 13, the word is used twice. Both times it's involved with the so-called false prophet who gives lying signs, you know. Once it shows up in chapter 16, in which evil spirits go out and perform miraculous lying signs to muster the armies of the world and the kings of the earth to launch an attack against God's people. One more time it shows up in chapter 19, again with reference to the false prophet and his lying signs. And so we have the word used 7 times, 3 for heaven, 4 for earth. That really follows the general symbolism of numbers in Revelation. Here, however, we find that the sign is called a semeion mage, a mega sign. It's a great sign because in some ways it is thematic. This sign, this woman, you see, is really what the rest of the book of Revelation is about. And so it's going to be highlighting her status, her importance in particular. The first thing we're told about this sign is that it's in heaven, because the true status of God's people is in heaven. We must never forget that. I know we live on earth, you know, that's a given, but the New Testament tells us repeatedly we are seated with Christ in heavenly places. When he sat down and took his position at the right hand of God to become the ruler of the kings of the earth, we as his people join him. We are said to reign with him on earth, but it's because we are seated with him in the heavenlies. And so this sign is a sign of a woman in heaven, even though her warfare, it's going to be manifestly obvious as we go along, is a warfare that takes place on earth. This is said to be a woman. Well, it's a familiar image as we look through the scriptures. As I said earlier, we find oftentimes the people of God are depicted for us in terms of the female in connection with the relationship to God, who is the great husband, as it were, of his people. This is so often repeated, I don't think I have to emphasize the point too much. If you're familiar with the Old Testament prophetic material, you've seen this many times. Isaiah, for example, says in chapter 54 of his great prophecy, "For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. And your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. He's called the God of the whole earth." That imagery of the woman married to her covenant Lord and King and God is carried forward in the New Testament. We mentioned earlier, you're well aware that we have, of course, the bride of Christ, which is pictured for us in the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 5 and other texts use that kind of metaphorical language. On one occasion, some people came to John the Baptist, and they were wondering about him. Who are you? Are you the Christ? Who do you claim to be? And so on. And John, of course, makes a very interesting descriptive response of his status. He says, no, I'm not the Christ. But then he says this is in John chapter 3, verse 29. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. You see, that's Christ. He's the husband. So who's John the Baptist? John says, but the friend of the bridegroom, that's me, John the Baptist, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is fulfilled. So that's really the image we find. We're not surprised. It's not really too tough to figure out, that that's what's going on here. She's pictured as being in pain because birth pangs are coming upon her. This really does picture, of course, the painful longing for Messiah that dominated the history of God's people down through history. O come, Emmanuel. This was the longing of God's people for that day when Messiah would finally come. And so many texts in the Old Testament reflect this idea of birth pangs, looking forward to the day when Messiah would finally be born. We hear once again in Isaiah chapter 26, Lord, in trouble they have visited you. They've poured out a prayer when your chastening was upon them, as a woman with child is in pain and cries out in her pangs when she draws near the time of her delivery. So have we been in your sight, O Lord. We've been with child. We've been in pain. And this pain was only intensified. It became increasingly significant as the time of Messiah neared. There was the Babylonian captivity, which ramped up the pain. There was the Maccabean revolt, which ramped it up even more. And then certainly the Roman occupation and all of the grief that God's people were going through there. All of this really speaks to the idea of an anticipation of a moment in which finally the child would be born. And really this picture that we have here in Revelation 12 really does reflect rather vividly the story of God's people. We notice that John gives us three details concerning the woman, three descriptive elements, each of which gives us an insight into her character. The first of which is that she is clothed with the sun. This is the kind of language that's used biblically to speak of the glory of God's people. God's people have glory. We have glory. It's not intrinsic glory. That only belongs to God, but it is derivative. It is reflected glory. Jesus says to his disciples and to his followers, you are the light of the world. You shine, Paul tells us, as in a dark world. We do have glory, and we need to understand that. It's not because we're so talented or eloquent or all of those. It's just that God has given it to us. And how often do we find that point celebrated biblically? Again, the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 60, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and the deep the darkness of the people. But the Lord will arise over you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And if you belong to Christ, you carry that glory. Do you hear me? You carry that glory with you wherever you go, because she is robed, clothed, you see, with the sun. She has the moon under her feet. Now, that doesn't mean she's standing on the moon or anything like that. We again need to say that the moon has a poetic significance as it's used throughout the scripture. Generally, the moon stands for the changing seasons. It stands for the idea that things on this world can be in flux and change. And of course, the moon becomes kind of a measure of that ongoing fluctuation. But the point is, she has the moon under her feet, a way of saying that even though things change, she doesn't change. She is God's possession. She is the one who is a fixed reality through history. There have been plenty of attempts to wipe out the church. You know that. The church has been beleaguered in many parts of the world. Today, there are serious attempts to wipe out God's people, and that's been a theme throughout history. But Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And thus she has the moon under her feet. You see, she rises above the vagaries and vicissitudes of life on this planet. She has a crown of 12 stars. Well, of course, the number 12 almost invariably is a way of reminding us of the people of God, the 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, the 12 apostles of the Lamb in the New. And so all of this is simply a further way of identifying her status. So we have her figured out. This is God's people, especially God's people looking down through history to the moment of Messiah's birth. And now we have this interesting additional detail. She is with child, cried out in labor as she was about to give birth. Crying out with labor pains. Very interesting. The whole idea of the labor pains associated with birth go clear back to the book of Genesis, what's called the Proto-Evangelion. And you remember the story. It's very important. It plays strategically in our text here. Because in Genesis, a serpent came on the scene, deceiving the original couple there in paradise, and they were seduced into disobeying God, and therefore judgments had to be pronounced. One judgment against Adam, you recall. The judgment with respect to Eve was very interesting because it announces for the first time the travail, the birth pangs that will be associated with childbirth. But there's also this profound promise. It's called the Proto-Evangelion, the first announcement of the gospel. When we hear the seed of the woman. In Greek, it's a very odd expression. The sperma, that's the Greek word, of the woman. We don't usually think of sperma, in connection with the woman, but this is an allusion to the virgin birth, in which we do have the seed of the woman, what? Will crush the head of that serpent. And that's really exactly what we're having pictured here. This is the moment now when that seed of the woman is going to be birthed. There's travail, just as had been said to Eve, but now the moment comes in which now this Messiah will appear and he is going to crush the head. That's why the very next scene in our discussion of chapter 12 will be the dragon is kicked out of heaven. His head is crushed. He is terminated. He's eliminated, you see, in terms of the power that he had in heaven. Now, he still exercises some power. We'll talk about that. But the point is that status of his in heaven has been removed, and he's been greatly humiliated and diminished in his authority. So here we have it. She is with child. She's crying out in pain. This is a theme revisited, of course, many times in the scriptures. I think one of the most dramatic expressions is in the New Testament, however, in connection with the Virgin Mary. We can't read this text without, of course, thinking of the Virgin Mary. She sort of brings to a laser beam point the whole story that we're dealing with here. But you remember how she picks up this very same theme in what's called the Magnificat. This is her exclamation of praise that now the time has come for the crushing of the head, the judgment of those who are the wicked opponents of God and his purposes in the world, and the great vindication of God's people. Listen to this language. This is Luke's report of the Magnificat, as it's called. Mary gave this, of course, in the home of Elizabeth. You remember it. Listen to these words. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He's put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. He's filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he sent away empty. He's helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his seed forever. Mary herself was given this remarkable prophetic insight into the significance of what's happening, as she in particular is going to be the vehicle by which Messiah is born. Well, she cries out in pain. This longing for Messiah that had been resounding down through the centuries is now finally going to be realized in this moment. Isaiah said, "As a woman with child is in pain and cries out in her pangs when she draws near the time of delivery, so have we been in your sight." But other prophetic sources give a similar kind of description. Micah, a later prophet, says this, quote, "Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in birth pangs. For now you shall go forth from the city, you shall dwell in the field, and to Babylon you shall go." Micah, of course, anticipating the Babylonian captivity. But you see, what's happened here is an even greater Babylon has now been dominating the lives of God's people. The corrupt religion married to the corrupt state of Jerusalem have really impoverished God's people. And so they will now be delivered from an even greater Babylon than Micah was referring to originally in that text. You shall be delivered, he says, and there the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. So this is it. This is the moment when this great deliverance is going to occur, in which the judgments are going to be poured out. One commentator put it in these words, quote, "From the proto-evangelion to the flood, from the Abrahamic covenant through the slavery in Egypt, the Exodus, the settling of Canaan, the Babylonian captivity, the return from exile, the suffering under the Greeks, the Maccabean revolt, the Romans, Roman occupation right at this moment, Israel was laboring to give birth to Christ and to bring in the Messianic age." And that is exactly the way the New Testament describes what's going on here. Jesus, when he was giving his upper room discourse to his disciples, you recall they were very sorrowful because of the things that he was saying to them, and he ties their sorrow to a woman in birth pangs. He even draws that parallel. Listen to these words from John chapter 16. He says, quote, "A woman when she is in labor has sorrow, because her hour has come. But as soon as she's given birth to a child, she no longer remembers the anguish for the joy that a man has been born into the world." And Jesus says to his disciples, "Therefore you, disciples of mine, now have sorrow." You are in a sense participating in this sorrow of these birth pangs. But then he says, "I will see you again, and your heart will rejoice, your joy no one will take from you." So this is the moment that is celebrated in the New Testament, given to us in the imagery here of this chapter in Revelation. She's about to give birth. This is language that's drawn from Isaiah and prophetic texts elsewhere, but it's been recognized that the one text, maybe more than any other, which lies behind the imagery that we find here in Revelation 12, can be found in Isaiah chapter 7. You may know that we often read that text during the Christmas season. Another commentator of a different generation, Philip Carrington, drawing that parallel, makes the following remark. He says, the actual words, that is the words here in Revelation 12, the actual words are drawn not from any heathen myth. And I need to say to you, there's been some critical commentators along the way who've tried to find in Revelation 12 a certain pagan mythology, and they want to go off in that direction. Well, Carrington correctly dismisses that. That's not what's going on here, of course. He says the real backdrop for the images that we find in Revelation 12 is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 7. Quote, "Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, asking, saying to him, "Ask a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above." Or Carrington says, to put it in the language of Revelation, the abyss or the heavens, you know. You may remember the story there in Isaiah chapter 7. Ahaz, the king of Judah, has just made a deal with the devil. You know, he's entered into a covenant with Assyria to come and defend him against an attack by some local rulers. And Isaiah goes out to really challenge that and to correct him and says, "Look, Ahaz, you don't need to rely on foreign governors, foreign powers to defend you. Ask of God. He will be here for you if you'll just put your trust in him. He will care for you. And if you don't believe it, then ask for a sign." Isaiah says, "What do you want, a sign in heaven? Fine. You want a sign on earth? Just ask for it." Well, of course, you recall Ahaz hypocritically demurs. "Oh, no, I would never ask God for a sign. I wouldn't put God to the test, you know." Well, his hypocrisy is glaring, and Isaiah is not very happy about that. And so Isaiah says to Ahaz, "Okay, pal, if you won't ask for a sign, then God's just going to feed you one anyway, and here it is. The Lord himself is going to give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Now that text had meaning for Ahaz. I'm not going to take time to explore it. We can look at that separately. But the point is, you know, the New Testament picks up that very statement and repeats it as a declaration of the significance of the birth of Christ. He is this Emmanuel who's coming on the scene. He is the one who is going to crush the head of the serpent. He is the one who represents the greatest sign, if you will, of all human history, and it's that that's being celebrated here in the language that we find in Revelation 12. Again, a commentator says, quote, "John is announcing the birth of the male child, the warrior king, foretold by Isaiah. So John brings together all the woman imagery of the Bible for his portrait of the covenant community. She is Eve, you know, going clear back to the proto-evangelion, the announcement to Eve. That's this woman. She is also Sarah, the wife of Abraham, through whom the seed of promise came, Isaac, as you know. Rebekah, Rachel, Jochebed, who was the mother of Moses and Aaron. Hannah, the mother of Samuel. And of course, the Virgin Mary. But he adds, she is not any of these in particular. You see, it's a broader imagery than that. Each embodied before the world a different facet of this woman's meaning. So there we have it. There's this woman, remarkable description. All of these things are said of her, but now we see a kind of a dark cloud, you know, shows up, because verse 3 introduces another sign in heaven, and this one is a great fiery red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on his heads. Scary. This is the second sign. It's also in heaven. So along with the woman, this is a sign in heaven, because you see, up until this moment, up until the work of Christ, Satan had a heavenly status. Job chapters 1 and 2 is enough to prove that, but it's alluded to elsewhere. Satan had a role as the prosecutor in the courtroom of heaven in the divine council, the great trial system there, you know, that's kind of behind the scenes in the drama of the Bible, but he's going to be soon expelled. He's in heaven for the moment, but the next time we're together, we're going to see that he gets booted out. He's depicted for us as a dragon. He's depicted for us as a serpent, reminding us of the Genesis serpent. He answers to, in the Old Testament, Leviathan. This is this kind of diabolical character that shows up in a variety of ways. If we look at the drama of the New Testament story, of course, we can't help but think of Herod. Herod, in a sense, is the human expression of the diabolical animosity against the birth of Christ. The killing of the children in Bethlehem is enough to prove that point. Interestingly, by the way, the family color of Herod was red, and this is a red dragon. Now, I know some of you are thinking that that makes him the first great Republican. Don't you go there. But nevertheless, red did belong to Herod, and he does represent, in a sense, the human expression of this hellish force that's seeking to do away with Messiah. Just as there were three details that described the woman, there are three details that describe this dragon. The first of all is that he has 7 heads. This goes back to Daniel chapter 7. If you're familiar with that text, you know that Daniel saw a vision. And in that vision, 4 beasts came out of the sea. But if you count the heads, you'll find there's 7 heads, you see, because one of the beasts had more than one head. And so immediately our mind goes back to that. This represents the great sort of Gentile powers that are inspired by diabolical forces. The fact that there's 7 heads gives rise to this kind of monstrous image of a beast that just can't be killed. You know, you kill a head and it grows a new one. That's the whole idea. You never can get rid of all the heads, you know. Even in Revelation, we hear in chapter 13, one of the heads was wounded with a fatal blow. We thought that was it, but no, it came right back. We'll talk about what that means when we get there. But the underlying theme here is that you just can't seem to get this thing out of the way. In the Old Testament, there are multiple head-crushing incidents, but he keeps coming back. But the point here is that now that final head crushing is going to occur. What was promised to Eve back in the Garden of Eden is now finally going to be realized. He'll be booted out of heaven. He's going to lose his status. He's going to lose his influence. We'll see how all that plays out as we go along. The New Testament is replete, of course, with declarations to this effect. Just by way of example, Jesus said to his followers on one occasion, "Now, with my work, judgment is in this world, and now the ruler of this world will be cast out." You see, that's what Revelation 12 is about. The ruler of this world, who's been usurping the authority and control of this world ever since the garden, is about to get the boot. And that's what the work of Christ is really accomplishing. Again, we have Paul writing to the Romans, this magnificent summa of his great theological insight is finally brought to a conclusion in the final benediction of the book. And listen to what he says. He's saying this 15 years before the great events of 70 AD. And he says this to these Christian people: "The God of peace will crush Satan under your feet very soon." And it would happen very soon. This is what the drama that's unfolding here is all about. So he has the 7 heads. He has 10 horns. Horns, I think you know in the Old Testament, we've seen this before, stand for power, usually kind of raw power. 10 of them would suggest to us power that would be irresistible, power that appears as if no one could ever fight it off. In chapter 13, we'll hear the question, who can make war against the beast? Who is like him? He just seems like this monstrous character that nobody could possibly outdo or defeat or anything like that. And that does appear to be the Roman force, the Roman might that was at work, a power that seemed so irresistible, nobody could stop this thug from getting his way in the world that was playing out in that scene. And so that's another element of this powerful character that's pictured for us here. He has 7 diadems, is the word, or crowns. Actually, the New Testament Greek has 2 words for crown. One is stephanos. We get the name Stephen from that. It means a crown, but it was a laurel crown. It was the crown of legitimate glory for victory in some kind of contest, whether warfare or the Olympic Games, you know, whatever. But it stood for legitimate authority, the crown, the stephanos. But this is the word diademata. We get the word diadem from this. This is a different kind of crown. This is the crown that comes strictly by the might of an iron fist. It is not necessarily legitimate right. It's simply the right that is exercised by a thug. Someone who can throw something at you, beat you with a stick, otherwise coerce from you what he wants from you without any kind of legitimate basis for his actions. And that's the term that's used here for this great diabolical character that is now throwing his weight around in the situation described here. One commentator said, this is not the evil of confused good. You know, it is possible to have legitimate authority and abuse it. It's possible to have a good motive and yet pursue that goal with illegitimate means. That's confused good, and we certainly see a lot of that. I mean, there's no question about that. But there's another kind of evil in the world, and it's just the diabolical, fundamental hatred of God just because He's there. And that is a very different thing, and that's really what's being pictured for us here. This is rather, our commentator says, the evil of single-minded determination to dethrone God Himself. There's a passionate hatred of God in this world. It's usually camouflaged. Usually comes, as they say, subspecies boni. It comes under the auspices of the good, trying to legitimize what it's doing by some kind of appeal to some sort of standard that anyone would probably agree to. But fundamentally, beneath the surface, something else is going on. One which one may glimpse from time to time in the public outrage against Christ, against His rule, and against every expression of legitimate authority in this world. The power of the thug pushing aside legitimate authority. And that's really what's suggested for us in the 4th verse. His tail swept a third of the stars out of heaven and threw them to the earth. And then the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child the moment it was born. What does this mean to say his tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky? Again, we have to go and ask, where do we find something like that described elsewhere? And one of the things that immediately comes to our attention is that there was, in the ancient view of things, and you see this reflected in the Bible, a notion that legitimate authority on earth was backed up by heavenly authority. That was a view of things, and the heavenly authority was sometimes suggested by stars. And so, to sweep a star out of the sky would be a way of pushing aside a legitimate authority on earth. One of, more than one example, but one example of this that we could refer to is found in Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 describes a character that comes on the scene known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was kind of a madman who was a ruler, but he did all kinds of things that had no legitimate basis in proper exercise of his authority. He was the one that precipitated the Maccabean revolt in the mid-2nd century BC by the atrocities that he committed among the people of God. Daniel, through the prophetic lens, anticipates the career of this character and makes this comment about him. He says, "It," referring to Antiochus, "grew up to the host of heaven and cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them." What he's actually describing is Antiochus wiping out legitimate authority in Israel, pushing them away to exercise his own display of the pure power of a thug you see among them, and that's what really caused the Maccabean revolt. Well, this character does the same thing. Herod, you might say, humanly, disregarding any legitimacy to his rule, just goes out and exercises the raw power of might just because he can do it, and of course especially trying to take it out on this young child who's going to be born there in Bethlehem. So he threw them to the earth. He threw legitimate authority out of the way, disrupting, dare I say, defunding the legitimate authorities in this world, pushing them aside so that he can carry out his diabolical schemes. And he came and he stood before the woman, ready to pounce, ready to exercise now his authority against this woman at this point. Well, he was waiting. Others have been waiting down through history. We hear in the New Testament of those who were waiting for the coming, the birth of Messiah. We hear, for example, of Joseph of Arimathea, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. We hear of Simeon in the temple, who was waiting for the consolation of Israel. We have two kinds of folks waiting. People who wanted to avoid their own destruction by destroying the Messiah, and those who wanted to find redemption in the Messiah. Two kinds of folks waiting. One commentator said the dragon plans to abort the work of Christ. The Old Testament is the ongoing story of the dragon trying to wipe out the seed. This all culminates in the attack by Herod on the children in Bethlehem. As it turns out, in wounding the seed's heel, the serpent's head was finally crushed. Well, she gave birth to a child, a male child. He will rule the nations with a rod of iron. We have the Christmas scene here. Jesus born in a barn, you know. There's the wise man, and there's also the diabolical powers seeking to swoop in. He is going to rule the world with a rod of iron. Imagery from the Old Testament. Think about what we read in Psalm chapter 2. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said, you are my son. Today I've begotten you. Ask of me, I will give you the nations for your inheritance, the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like pottery. This rod of iron, by the way, is not coercive authority. It's not the kind of thing that just is exercised like a thug, you know. This is, in fact, the power of the Word. That's why so often the Word is described in this kind of language. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, Isaiah writes, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, his word, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. In Revelation 19, the rider on the horse riding into the pages of human history, followed by the armies of heaven, who are in fact God's people working on earth, is described in the same way. Now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that he should strike the nations, a sharp sword out of his mouth. He will rule them with the rod of iron. The rod of iron is the Word of God. Christ in the ascension is caught up to the throne. He is there ruling over the kings of the earth, immune from the attacks of this dragon, but the church, his people, are still exposed to them. And of course, we understand from the New Testament that attacks on the church are in fact attacks on Christ. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Was what Jesus said to Saul of Tarsus. So the woman now, as we wrap this up, flees into the wilderness. We'll look at this in more detail because we return to this theme later in Revelation chapter 12. This is God's people fleeing into the wilderness, just as in the Old Testament the Israelites had, Elijah had, even the Apostle Paul spent some time in a wilderness. One commentator said, the woman fled as the Judean Christians fled destruction of Jerusalem. The dragon's wrath was expended on those destined for judgment. You see, Jerusalem fell. This wrath was expended on Jerusalem, but the people of God escaped. They were guarded for 1,260 days, the 3.5 years of the Jewish wars. This is reminiscent of Elijah's sojourn for 3.5 years in the wilderness, fed by ravens. They're in a place prepared for them by God, a place of protection. They are fed there, kind of like the manna in the wilderness. Elijah fed by ravens for 3.5 years, and that's really where we're going to leave our conversation today. We'll look at some of these themes a little bit more because they come back later in chapter 12. Well, glad to have you in Sunday School. Thanks for joining in. We're going to wrap up at this point. I have 3 thoughts. They really go back to what we said about the woman, which is us. This is really us, and the descriptive terms we need to recognize apply to us as well. We hear, first of all, that she is robed with the sun. And of course, it reminds us that the people of God reflect the glory of God, shining as lights in a dark world, pointing men and women to the only source of human worth, dignity, and liberty. We hear, occasionally in our culture these days about lives that matter. I'm going to tell you that we as God's people have a remarkable privilege. We can look into the eyes of any human being, regardless of their background, their intelligence, their ethnicity, their skin color. We can look into the eyes of any human being in the language of that little song I used to sing as a kid, red and yellow, black and white. We can look into every eye of every human being we meet and say with sincerity, your life matters. Your life matters to the God of heaven and earth, and I have the great privilege of extending to you the message of redemption. Will you bow the knee with me before King Jesus? Because someday every knee will bow, and it's better to bow in repentance than to bow in the context of judgment. We also hear the woman has the moon under her feet. The people of God survive the assaults, the persecutions, the abuses of this world because they are guarded by Christ. and he has promised that the gates of hell will not prevail against her. Tertullian said the blood of the martyr is the seed of the church. Been plenty of attempts to get rid of the church, but you know, she keeps coming back and keeps getting stronger. And that's really part of what this imagery of the woman is supposed to communicate to us. Finally, she has a crown of 12 stars, speaking of the destiny and true identity of these people, this woman. The people of God are the heart of God's purpose in the world. Some people wonder, what's the point of history? Well, I'll tell you what the point of history is. It is what God is doing with his people. And so we, as God's people, are sharing a great history, as old as Eden and as new as the eternal destiny of the bride of Christ. Well, thanks for joining in. Appreciate having you here. I hope you'll be able to come back in about a week when we'll be adding the next of this series as we go along. But until then, may God richly bless you and keep you, and we'll see you next time.